Hi everyone. What I'm about to share next is intense and extremely unsettling. Yesterday at 3 a.m., my channel inbox pinged with a single email from an address that vanished before I could reply. No greeting, no signature, just the subject line. Read this once, save, offline, delete. Attached was a text file. I scanned it for malware. It was clean. Then I opened it, and what I read was equally as incredible as it was disturbing. I'm going to read it now exactly as it came to me. So do yourself a favor. Put on headphones, dim the lights, and listen very carefully to what happened. The night everything changed for me was July 18th, 2023, at 2200 hours in Fort Liberty, North Carolina. 4 of us, Staff Sergeant Rick Wilcox, Specialist Danielle Collins, Specialist Marcus Mason, and me, Staff Sergeant Logan Reyes, were running a standard night vision drill in the plywood shoot house. Private Eli Decker was up in the guard tower monitoring with thermals. At 22:15, Decker radioed that he saw a tall figure beyond the perimeter. No gear, no reflectors, standing motionless. Range control brushed it off as maybe a deer. 5 minutes later, Decker's radio burst into a distorted screech, like a modem tone, and then nothing. Right after that, our generators cut out. No lights, no hum, just silence. Rick gave the order to sweep the area. We moved into the tree line with night vision goggles. Danielle kept trying to radio back in, but each time, that same scrambled tone. Near the creek, I noticed the air had a sharp chemical smell, like coolant or fuel. Maybe an old vehicle had been dumped nearby. Then, around 22:47, we spotted something. A human-sized figure, pale, unmoving. Our goggles showed no heat signature. I called out the standard challenge. No response. Instead, it climbed a pine, fast, efficient, no hesitation. Danielle tried to record, but her cam shut off instantly. Seconds later, 2 unmarked helicopters flew overhead. Low, no lights. One flashed a spotlight for maybe 3 seconds. In that moment, we saw the figure perched near the skid. Then the light cut, and they flew off toward Simmons Field. We regrouped. Back on the gravel road, 3 black Suburbans waited. No markings, but what looked like government plates. 6 individuals stepped out, flight suits, no rank, no unit patches, just a silver crescent inside a black triangle. One addressed me by name before I said anything. They took our gear, swapped out memory cards, and ran UV lights over our hands. Then they transported us to Womack Medical for what they called contamination protocol. There, we were isolated. They scrubbed us down, ran blood tests, and scanned us, full body, even a CT scan. A civilian doctor kept asking about how the figure moved, whether we noticed muscle contractions, how it reacted to sound. He typed everything into a tablet with that same triangle logo. By sunrise, Rick, Danielle, and Marcus were gone. I was discharged with paperwork saying, heat-related incident, 72-hour observation. My on-base housing lock was changed and my belongings were gone. Somehow, my records now said I'd been retired on July 18th. No orders, no signatures, just wiped out. I took what little cash I had and checked into a small hotel. A week later, on July 25th, my hotel phone buzzed. When I picked it up, a voice said, "You were never there." Then static and a black screen. I pulled the battery from my phone and left town. I was completely freaked out and running on flight or fight mode. For a while, I lived off convenience store food and fought a non-stop ringing in my left ear. In early August, a Baton Rouge P.O. box I'd set up under a fake name had a manila envelope delivered. Inside the envelope was an SD card and a note that said, "You missed something." On the card was Danielle's helmet cam footage. One frozen frame caught the figure mid-jump, with what looked like a military insignia burned into its skin. Hard to say. Could have been faked. but it looked like our own unit's patch. Now I'm really freaking out. Finally, I couldn't stand running anymore. On September 7th, I went back to Fort Liberty with my retiree ID. Somehow they knew I was coming. A civilian woman met me at the gate, Dr. Naomi Park, from something called Advanced Projects. She brought me to a trailer, pulled up drone footage over the range. We watched the screen as a red dot pulsed near that same creek. Shockingly, another showed on my chest, my vitals. I was somehow connected to something back there. She looked straight at me and slowly revealed what was going on. She said the figure was part of a controlled experiment and that it was tied to biometric feedback from our unit, a kind of behavioral mirroring system. It was supposed to act based on preloaded tactical instincts, only it had started improvising. She asked me to help contain it. I said absolutely not, but they gave me no choice. They geared me up with a new uniform, stripped of reflective markers, dropped me at the tree line at 0430. They mic'd me up and told me to use a phrase they'd extracted from our squad audio logs. Let's clean house, Blue 3, push. The moment I said it, the figure emerged, moved like it knew me. Up close, I saw what looked like strange tubing beneath its skin, huge vein-like tubes that almost looked hydraulic. A torn American flag patch was fused into the chest plate. This thing was trying to look like us. Then the air shimmered and something clicked, and there was a white flash. The figure staggered. That's when it lunged. It moved fast, and then something came flying at me and hit me hard. It wasn't painful, but I blacked out. I remembered everything in reverse. Every drill, every mission, every order. I woke up on a stretcher off to the side in what looked like an aircraft hangar. Park and her team were boxing the figure into a containment tank. Somehow they had captured it. Within minutes, she told me to stay put and explained that it had copied my reflexes through some kind of induced synaptic sync. Said it could now predict and outperform trained operators. They were in the process of sending it to Fort Detrick for further study. Then suddenly alarms went off. I watched its vitals spike on the monitor. 2 guards approached, and the thing shattered the tank with one arm. Absolute chaos ensued. People ran. I shot up and jumped into a utility van and drove out an open gate before anyone stopped me. Since then, I've just been on the road, staying on back roads and keeping low. I still hear the screech on AM radio from time to time. But life is hard. My bank cards don't work. I'm working odd jobs and living out of the van I took. I changed the tags, but don't ask me how I got them. So if you're ever in coastal North Carolina and hear a screech on the radio, kill the power instantly. Don't say your name. Don't say or respond to the words Blue 3. I'm still trying to figure out how to get completely away. This thing remembers who trained it. And if you think we've ever worked together, you're on its radar too. I'm sending this email before my device wipes itself. Save it, print it, burn it to disk, whatever you choose. And if you ever smell that sharp coolant scent in the woods, run, don't walk. I wasn't sure how else to get this to you, but I've been carrying it around in my head since 2009. I was a Navy radio operator stationed at Naval Radio Station Jim Creek in Washington from 2007 to late 2010. Most folks outside the military don't realize how important Jim Creek is. It's basically one of the largest communications facilities in the U.S. Navy arsenal, nestled in the Cascade Range. It's surrounded by miles of dense forest and has this unpredictable weather that constantly messed with our signals. A lot of nights, I'd be down in the comms room picking up static, bits of coded traffic from various Pacific Fleet movements, regular supply transmissions. But then there was one particular night, late August 2009, when everything changed for me. I remember the day started normally enough, aside from the irritating drizzle that was so typical for that part of Washington. We had a rumor going around that the USS Nimitz was due to dock at Naval Station Everett south of us, but I never got confirmation because half the channels were tied up with backlogged messages from Pearl Harbor. I'd been trying to unscramble a routine supply order when I accidentally locked onto a highly classified channel. We all knew that classified frequencies existed, usually for sensitive ops involving submarines or special forces. But I noticed the code identifier was nothing I'd seen before, something with an RB47 prefix that suggested it was above my pay grade. At first I thought it was some routine administrative chatter, maybe about a training op, because the word containment got repeated a lot. But this conversation had an edge to it. My earpiece was crackling with frantic instructions about an asset that had been captured. They mentioned a forward location near Joint Base Lewis McChord, which was odd since that's primarily Army Air Force territory. The weirdest part, though, was they kept saying Code Wendigo. At the time, I only vaguely knew what a Wendigo was, from some Native American legends I'd heard growing up in Idaho, but hearing it from these official-sounding voices put me on edge. The next chunk of traffic got more specific than I expected. They were talking about specialized metal restraints, motion-activated sedation measures, and an immediate transfer to a secure underground lab. No location name, no building designation, but they mentioned employing a specialized containment unit out of Naval Base Kitsap. I know that area has a ton of restricted facilities for nuclear subs, but I never imagined they'd funnel something so bizarre through there. The operators on the channel seemed jumpy, cutting each other off and referencing a classified biological threat. I spent over an hour flipping between channels trying to figure out if I'd accidentally tuned in to some elaborate training scenario, because the tone was so urgent it almost felt like a real crisis. You have to understand, the possibility of it being some drill wasn't unusual. We had those all the time, though usually they were clearly labeled and used standardized codes. But this had no trace of routine exercise disclaimers. I started to piece together bits like the creature's height being well over 7 feet, the presence of elongated limbs, and an unnatural speed at which it moved when it was first confronted by a joint force police detail outside the base perimeter. They kept referencing how local wildlife near the training area was found ripped up in ways that the base game wardens couldn't explain, like deer with bones cleanly snapped in two. It was so grisly that it even disturbed some of the more hardened Marines. I got the sense they'd tried to keep this under wraps until it attacked a patrol, and that's when they had no choice but to bring in what they called special assets. I wish I could say I shut off the feed at that point, but my morbid curiosity had me fiddling with the tuner, trying to catch every last detail. One voice, obviously in a leadership role, insisted on authorizing lethal force if sedation failed, but another voice kept emphasizing that the priority was intact retrieval. I remember that wording clearly, intact retrieval. It sounded so cold, like they didn't just want to kill this thing. They wanted it alive and presumably for study. It all reminded me of something out of those old X-Files episodes, but there was no laughing in that room. No mood of any kind that suggested fiction. One of the more chilling things was how a couple of the voices casually talked about similar incidents up near Great Lakes in Illinois a few years prior. That mention popped up briefly, then got overshadowed by this conversation about which facility had the right sedation protocols. But it stuck with me because it implied this wasn't a one-off. I started scribbling down notes, half out of habit, half out of a stunned sense that I might be hearing something I shouldn't. I remember my hand was trembling so badly I could hardly read my own writing when I got done. Now, I went on a tangent after that. I tried to do casual digging on the side, nothing official, just asking around. I asked a friend from my training days who had been stationed at Whidbey Island if he'd heard anything about weird captures or cryptid-type events. He claimed ignorance or maybe feigned ignorance. Then a couple months later, I heard a rumor from a petty officer that there'd been an unusual cargo transport, escorted by blacked-out trucks from Lewis McChord to a restricted hangar somewhere closer to the coast. But if you push too hard in these circles, people shut down. No one wants to risk losing their clearance or worse. That entire time, a hush fell over the comms about the Wendigo topic. Like once they did the extraction or whatever they wanted to do, they buried it. No more chatter. I kept expecting some big leak in the local news about a horrible accident or a wild animal attack, but there was nothing. Just the usual local stories about minor incidents, maybe a mention of a missing hiker or 2 weeks later, a bear attack somewhere off limits. It's always pinned on big cats or black bears in that region. You ever notice how often unexplained attacks get pinned on the local wildlife? Anyway, that's all I ever heard about that specific event. Over the following weeks, though, I had this gnawing anxiety whenever I came on shift. Every time I spun the dial into those classified frequencies, I half expected to pick up another scramble about containment. But it never happened. Not for that specifically. Instead, I picked up on a handful of references that made me think there were other ops going on around the state, but it's hard to confirm. So much of that info is short transmissions, quickly coded, and my clearance level wasn't high enough to decrypt it. The weirdest part about all this might be the fact that no one else I spoke with on my watch would even address it. One day, my direct supervisor came over to my station and quietly told me I was better off not snooping. He said it casually, in that scolding but friendly Navy way, but I knew it was a warning. After that, I never brought it up on the job again. I don't know what's stranger, that this so-called Wendigo was apparently real enough for the military to mobilize an entire specialized unit, or that they managed to keep it so tightly under wraps. I've thought a lot about how it ties into local legends. There are so many stories about odd creatures in the Pacific Northwest. Even told rumors that sometimes the freshly assigned guys at the base would see huge, emaciated figures at the tree line late at night. They'd say it was just exhaustion, or maybe the local elk population playing tricks on them in low light. We all laughed it off as typical base scuttlebutt, but after hearing those transmissions, I'm not so sure. I still have some scraps of the notes I took that night, though half the abbreviations I used don't make sense to me anymore. There was mention of something called Project Redwood, and the words Nightfall Readiness got repeated a couple times. I've scoured old references to see if I could dig up anything official on that project name. Nothing. It's like it never existed, or it's so buried that random staff like me aren't going to find it. That's the bulk of it. I never officially reported this because I didn't want to be slapped with an NDA or worse, and I had to keep my clearance. After my contract ended in 2010, I went back to civilian life. But it stuck with me. Just the idea that the government or the military might be tangling with things we only hear about in old folklore. And they're apparently capturing them, studying them. The entire concept that these creatures exist at all is enough to unnerve me to this day. I don't have any pictures, obviously. This was all audio intercept. But the sincerity of those voices and those codes, none of it sounded staged. I know how training ops read, and they're typically very structured, with specific language that's standardized. This was not that. It was messy, intense, and absolutely real sounding. That's all I can share, but it's been on my conscience for years, so I hope letting you know gives you something to work with for your YouTube channel. I'm sure there are others out there who might have overheard bits and pieces, but most people haven't said a word. They're either too scared or too busy trying to forget what they heard. I'm the mayor of a smaller municipality here in Mason County, West Virginia, not too far from Point Pleasant. I won't name the town explicitly in the email. Someone might stumble upon this, and I'd hate to see a local fiasco if it got out. I was going through some dusty records down in the archive hall, basically a converted storage space that used to be a garage out back behind the main building. I was searching for documents relating to a budget shortfall we had back in 1978, something about a sewage plant expansion that was never completed, and I suspected there was an outstanding allocation from the state that might still be in limbo. We keep all kinds of older records shoved into metal filing cabinets that have probably never been moved or cleaned since Carter was president. Anyway, One box labeled Building Code Revisions, 1975 to 1979, caught my eye because the top was half-eaten by silverfish, and I'm trying to piece together the puzzle of why this expansion never officially happened. I opened the box, and the first few files were exactly what I expected. Boring old contract bids from local firms, some typewritten correspondence, etc. But tucked behind a folder for city planning was an unlabeled manila envelope, sealed up by Scotch tape. It just said, Re-M-N sightings, scrawled in faint pencil. It took me a minute to recognize it as M-N, but once I peeled that tape off and read the first line inside, my heart started racing. It referenced Mothman sightings, specifically detailing repeated appearances near the old ammunition bunkers over in the McClintock Wildlife Management Area, what folks around here usually just call the TNT area. I nearly dropped the entire envelope when I read that these were not just random eyewitness accounts, but what looked like internal city memos. The memo was dated July 10th, 1976, and it was addressed to a city council member, someone who served under my predecessor's predecessor, if that makes sense. It said something about how our department has received multiple credible reports from designated watchers, and mentioned no official recognition of the figure or its alleged paranormal qualities. I actually had to read it 3 times to make sure it was real. Then came the weirdest part. It included references to a meeting with local law enforcement, not just the city police, but apparently a representative from the West Virginia State Police out of the Ripley detachment. They were apparently concerned about ongoing sightings around the TNT area that were causing undue public alarm and risking tourist interest. It specifically said that the Office of the Mayor advises no formal statement to be released. That blew me away. How could an entire sequence of sightings be kept under wraps for so long? I started flipping through more pages, and there were some extremely strange references to an unnamed consultant from Charleston who flew in at the city's request, presumably for hush-hush discussions. The documents described them as an anthropological field expert, but every mention was accompanied by lines blacked out with thick marker. And keep in mind, this was the late 70s, not decades after the big 1966-1967 sightings. Yet it looks like people in our local government had reason to think Mothman was hanging around well after that wave died down, at least in the public's eye. It was a far cry from the typical official statements you hear about, the usual rumors or the alleged legend that revolve around the TNT area. There was also a typed note from August 3rd, 1976, that mentioned a newly rebuilt section of State Route 62, the one that runs close to the TNT area. It detailed how the figure was apparently sighted walking near the brush on the highway shoulder late at night. Now, I personally know that Stretch can be creepy at night, dark as anything, and the mosquitoes get thick as soup in early August. The note read something along the lines of, "The figure has been recorded as unusually tall with broad wings spanning the full length of the roadway lane." Then the next part was blacked out, except for a single sentence. Council acknowledges significance and directs immediate closure of the incident file. That's literally how it was typed. Closure of the incident file. At that point, my head was spinning. I recall hearing from my grandmother, she was alive during the Silver Bridge collapse in 1967, about the Mothman sightings a decade prior. She never believed it was a hoax, but she chalked it up to something unexplainable and left it at that. What these secret documents suggest, though, is that certain officials within our city government had been actively trying to contain and minimize any talk because they worried it'd either scare people away or cause some weird panic. I'm not positive if it was all about tourism or property values or they truly believed in a supernatural threat, maybe all 3. But the level of involvement with city council members and a mayor's office directive is chilling. It's not like we had loads of resources back then. We're talking about a small West Virginia town overshadowed by bigger cities in the state. Yet they seem to handle it with kid gloves, always writing in coded language. Something else that surprised me. Some of these memos referenced a possible tie to what happened after the Silver Bridge collapse, obviously back in December 1967. The archived notes implied that the sightings never really stopped. They just garnered less attention because once that tragedy was done, the main focus was on public safety in a more traditional sense, inspection of bridges, highways, and so forth. But it looks like behind the scenes, folks at City Hall were quietly documenting sporadic winged creature sightings for nearly a decade after the fact. There was even a letter from a DC official about some classified phenomenon that I couldn't fully decipher because half of it was missing or torn off. All I could read was, "Continue standard denial, maintain local level control." That's it. The letter had a typed signature, but the name was gone. What's gnawing at me is that city officials, some of whom have their portraits hung in our main council chamber, were apparently in the know. One of them, a deputy mayor from 1975 to 1977, who by all accounts was well respected until he passed, wrote a personal note in shaky script that said, "We must consult with the Charleston official once more, or else risk exposure." This indicates a direct line to a bigger network of hush-hush watchers, or maybe something more official. I mean, we're not talking about chain-smoking ufologists in a back room here. We're talking about city officials who had budgets, final say on local ordinances, and an oath to serve the people honestly. I started to get paranoid. Frankly, I still am. I locked up the documents in my private office desk for now. I don't want them falling into the wrong hands or, drastically, getting misplaced. Our city clerk nearly caught me reading them, and I had to pretend I was looking at old property tax forms. Part of me wants to go public, but the other part says that if they kept it under wraps for so long, there might be a reason for it, a reason that could get me in trouble if I blow the lid off everything blindly. A couple nights ago, I drove out to the old TNT bunkers myself, just to see if anything felt off. I must have circled the gates for a good half hour. I didn't see anything resembling a winged humanoid, of course, but it all seems heavier now, like the place has a presence beyond just historical significance. You can almost feel something bearing down on you when you're out there alone. It made me wonder if my own staff or even the police might be aware of these older documents. The city manager can be pretty tight-lipped about certain topics. Then again, he's only been around for 10 years, so maybe not. But this persistent, crawling sense of dread has stayed with me ever since I opened that folder. I noticed one of the older city council members, who's been in office since the early 90s, made an offhand comment a few months back about strange airline or flight path changes near the area. She cryptically joked about not wanting to spook the neighbors with the big bird. I never gave it a second thought, but now I'm connecting dots that might be unrelated or might be the very heart of the matter. Maybe local politicians just carry these old ghost stories in the back of their mind and half joke about it. Or maybe she knows more than she lets on and was testing me. One more thing, there's a typed list of city officials who apparently got monthly bulletins, which included Mothman-related sightings, local suspicion, and rumored warnings. That list has 3 or 4 names I absolutely recognize from old dedication plaques around town. Part of me wants to contact their families to see if they left behind diaries or notes, but I'm afraid that might break open a can of worms, especially if there is still an unspoken code of silence. That's about as far as I can go with the details right now. I haven't even processed everything I found in that envelope, but it's definitely bigger than some random rumors. If the memos are legitimate, and they do look official, our town's leadership had a direct line on Mothman phenomena well after the initial 1966-1967 wave of sightings. They actively engaged with state or federal officials to muzzle the information. It makes me wonder how many small towns across the country have done the same, just tucking away weird correspondences in their city files and hoping nobody stumbles across them. I first heard about strange sightings around the Buffalo National River region back in 1992, when I was still a fairly green ranger at the time. I was stationed mostly near the Lost Valley area, and would occasionally do backcountry checks around the hemmed-in Hollow Falls. For the most part, it was the usual business: hikers getting off trail, the occasional misadventure with black bears, or just cleaning up after folks who didn't pack out their trash properly. But the talk among some of the older rangers always intrigued me. Whispers of creatures that weren't quite natural, especially around the more remote waterfalls and cave recesses off the main hiking routes. I never gave these rumors much validity until around the summer of 1997. That's when a couple of the part-timers came back from an overnight patrol saying they'd found what looked like a big animal den near a tributary that feeds into the Buffalo. The water's not nearly as dramatic as Hemmed-In Hollow, more like a cascade than a true waterfall, but it's still a steep, hidden area that doesn't see many visitors. They reported large tracks, bigger than any wolf or dog print they'd ever come across, and a powerful smell that they couldn't quite describe. One said it reminded him of a wet dog combined with rotting flesh, but in a weird, pungent sort of way that hovers in your nostrils even after you leave the spot. I shrugged it off at the time. We do have all manner of wildlife in Arkansas, and an unknown canine didn't really pique my concern. But by fall of that year, we started seeing deer carcasses in that stretch of forest. Not just the usual predator kills, though. Something about the way the carcasses were torn apart felt methodical. That might be too strong a word, but it was definitely odd. While black bears can make a messy scene and coyotes pick things clean, this had a different pattern to it. It didn't match the typical tracks or feeding behavior of any local predator. That in itself can happen from time to time. Nature never reads the rule book. But it was enough that more than one seasoned ranger noticed. What really pushed my curiosity was an incident in early April 1998. We had a storm system roll through that caused some minor flooding in the valleys. A few trees came down along the trail that runs parallel to that small, unnamed waterfall. As we cleared branches, I caught a glimpse of what I first thought was a large black bear crossing through the undergrowth at an awkward angle, kind of half hunched over, but it moved more like a big cat at times, quick, low to the ground, and strangely silent despite snapping a large branch underfoot. I tried reasoning with myself that it was just the shadows playing tricks on my eyes, especially with all the wind and debris swirling around. But something in my gut told me I was looking at something that shouldn't be there. The shape was too tall in the front legs when it rose up, almost like it was about to stand bipedally. I never caught a full look, but I'll never forget that outline. After things settled down, I asked some of the older guys if they'd ever seen anything similar. None admitted to seeing it directly, but one told me he'd heard about upright canines as an old folk legend in these parts, stories that go back to the earliest settlers around the Ozarks. He told me of old newspaper clippings referencing monstrous wolves that stood on hind legs and prowled around farmland in the late 1800s. I remember one part of the conversation in which he described how certain families refused to let their children wander near thick woodland areas, particularly around dusk. Kept them inside, said there were devil dogs out there. That rung in my head for weeks afterward. Throughout the next decade, I'd occasionally notice smaller details: broken branches about 6 feet above ground level, scratch marks on tree trunks that looked more like claw rakes than bare gouges, and a continued presence of what I can only call extremely large paw prints. One time in 2003, I tracked prints that led right up to one of the ephemeral pools near the bluff line. They vanished at the water's edge, no sign of crossing or doubling back. It was like whatever left them just disappeared, or managed a leap far bigger than any normal canine. When I tried to measure the stride, it was easily double the spacing of my own steps, and I'm 6'2". In the winter of 2005, after retiring from active duty, I picked up a seasonal part-time role at a smaller state park near the area. I'll keep that unnamed for reasons of privacy and to avoid stirring up curiosity seekers. That's when I started thinking that there might be more than just one of these creatures. Around that same region, A local told me about hearing howls late at night that didn't sound like coyotes. She said they were so resonant, she could feel them in her chest, and they had a guttural tone that suggested something with much larger lung capacity than a typical wild canine. I'd pass time reading up on sightings on the quiet days in the ranger station, scanning old archives, and a few nights I spent in the backwoods with my own audio recorder. Never caught the howls personally, but I did pick up faint noises that might have been distant yaps or barks echoing off the valley walls. Audio was too distorted to prove anything, but the sense of presence out there late at night was hard to ignore, like you're being watched from multiple angles at once. That was the feeling I got near that lesser-known waterfall anyway. My old buddy used to joke that I spooked easy for a big fella. But I don't scare that easy. This was different. The entire environment would go silent all at once, as if every living creature was bowing down to some unseen apex force. The next real incident happened in 2008 near the same isolated waterfall. We were on a routine check of the area, just me and a younger ranger. Strewn across the rocks at the base of the falls were large sections of fur from what we later identified as a black bear carcass. It was completely torn open, rib cage splayed. Now black bears are powerful animals, not easily dispatched. Coyotes or bobcats don't typically take down an adult bear. The only other real possibility in Arkansas might be another bear, but even then, the fur left behind didn't all match black bear hair. There were thick clumps of a coarse grayish-brown hair that none of us recognized. That same day, I noticed deep gouges in the rocky ledge that looked like something with massive claws had scraped it. Rocks can be scratched by many things if the conditions are right, but these grooves were so symmetrical that it was unsettling. The younger ranger was visibly shaken. He refused to talk about it afterward, resigned from the job a few months later, said something about an out-of-state opportunity. I always suspected that encounter played a role in his decision. I know folks online call these things dogman nowadays. Back then, we didn't really have a name for it other than the occasional upright cannid rumor or just calling it that weird creature. I never saw the face. My glimpses were always from behind or the side, mostly in poor light or partial cover. But I'll say that from my vantage, the shape of its head and the way its forelimbs hung did indeed suggest a canine. The chest appeared broad, almost like a man's when it would briefly stand or partially stand, and the ears definitely looked pointed from what little I could see. Then there's that sense of near self-awareness it seemed to project. It's hard to describe without sounding dramatic, but it didn't feel like a mere animal. All that leads me to believe there's a den or some kind of lair near that waterfall, maybe an entire system of caves or hidden alcoves in the bluffs. We do have extensive limestone formations in parts of the state, and hidden passages aren't uncommon. Sometimes I wonder how many other missing hunters or hikers might have gotten labeled as accidents or misadventures when there's more to the story. I recall there was a rumor floating around local law enforcement about a hiker who disappeared in 2009. The official cause of death was never conclusively determined, just found scraps of clothing and bone fragments. Of course, the official line was that he likely fell or was swept away during one of the flash floods, but I'll always question whether that's the entire truth. Truth is, I ended up moving a bit away from the Buffalo region in 2010, about a year after fully retiring, mainly because the tension, if you can call it that, became too much. Even though I wasn't patrolling every day anymore, I'd still find myself driving out there, poking my nose around that waterfall, searching for signs. Part of me wanted to catch more concrete evidence. Another part of me was terrified I might find it. I don't know if it's a single dogman or multiple, but I do believe they claim territories, and that hidden waterfall is squarely in the center. If I had to guess, that spot is prime for a lair or den thanks to how remote it is and the consistent source of fresh water. I know this probably sounds ridiculous to some folks out there, but I've lived in the wilderness long enough to know that nature holds plenty of secrets. These creatures, whatever they are, are experts at staying out of human sight when they choose. They're more elusive than any predator I've encountered, and that includes cougars, which can vanish into the brush like ghosts. Whenever I venture back to that area, there's a hush that falls over the forest. It's like everything else is giving the apex predators a wide berth.